Have you ever looked at a globe and thought, hey, wouldn't it be cool if all the smaller countries inside of this landmass united? Why don't we all just put aside our differences, become a massive union of superstates, and then go out for frosty chocolate milkshakes? That does sound cool, SpongeBoy me Bob. Think of all the good that it'll bring. Maybe we should just erase a few borders right about... Yeah, we all kinda saw that coming now, didn't we? Uniting a continent isn't as easy as it might seem on a paint-by-numbers country map. Even within a continent, you have a multitude of certain internal conflicts, be they economic, territorial, ethnic, or even something weird like a name dispute. I'm looking at you, Macedonia. Countries, unless there's some great uniting goal, like a war, don't tend to work together to the degree that we'd need for this scenario. But I am determined to find a means of bringing all these countries together within the respective continents in some way, shape, or form. Europe almost kinda did it under Germany. Twice. And under France. Twice. Wow. Funny how that works out, huh? The Americas are a little hit or miss, but the closest they were was probably during the Cold War. So that squares us off in the 20th century for this scenario, unless we go the route of colonial unity or annexing Canada and Mexico during the Napoleonic Wars. In that case, we could have Simon Bolivar's United States of Colombia as a unitary force in the south. Asia sort of had a communism sphere going on for a while, but otherwise, it's a little bit of a mess throughout most of its history. We could unite Asia under Japan, which is workable in an Axis victory, but then Australia, America, and Africa become a problem. Africa itself is going to be tough given the lack of cohesion, countless conflicts between various ethnic groups and nations, and, well, language barriers are always a problem. The most realistic cause for a unitary Africa would be a union of French and British colonial governments into a United States of Africa, perhaps with aid from African-American separatists and Pan-Africanists like Marcus Garvey. That would give us a time frame somewhere in the early 20th century. Australia, New Zealand, and Papua New Guinea were sort of united under British rule and don't really cause much trouble nor attract it, so there's a long stretch of time when such a thing could have been achieved. So, with all that in tow, what would be the optimal point of divergence? Given all these factors, it would probably be World War II, or rather around that period. Let's just say the post-World War I interwar period. We'll say that for the sake of this timeline, following the fallout of World War I, numerous African colonies began collaborating closely with one another and exert further autonomy from their European empires given that they would be in a weakened state. We likely see this in the case of South Africa, South Rhodesia, Angola, Mozambique, and some non-colonies like Ethiopia, while we could imagine French colonies forming closer ties with other North African nations like Libya or Egypt. During this time, Liberia was seeing a pretty hefty economic slump, and it would follow it for the rest of its existence even to this day. Had the US recognized the situation and thought, well, there might be some strategic asset to Liberia, could begin investing greater funds into it to preserve it and keep it, well, an asset, instead of just having it a territory that slowly becomes less valuable and ultimately slips away. Like a car that you don't drive, but still don't bother to keep in a garage or maintain. This could earn much support from individuals such as Garvey, who at the time was advocating for the African diaspora of the United States and Americas in general to migrate back to Africa and reclaim their ancestral land. It is also important to note that at this time there was a bit of a high level of ethnic tension in the US, so this may have some impact, perhaps beneficial, to the migration efforts of Garvey and perhaps even the US if there are plans to expand Liberia or a need to send more skilled labor to the protectorate. The factors of greater cooperation of the European colonies within Africa, as well as not only the migration of African Americans to the continent, but also this idea of Pan-Africanism, is going to be fundamental to us establishing a unitary Africa. It's going to be tough, but the end result of what we have right now is going to be two significant cooperation spheres, the Southeast and Northwest, with the French countries and North African Arabian nations cooperating up there, while South Africa and Ethiopia really focused on coordinating the British colonies around them. During the interwar and Great Depression period, Britain and France would of course continue to receive resources from their colonies as they did in our timeline, but there'd likely be a greater output as these colonies would be putting greater effort into reinvesting into their own development. So by this point in time, the African colonies and some independent African states are far better off than they were in our timeline, likely more capable, better armed, more advanced, yada 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 yada. 1935, Italy invades Ethiopia and fails terribly. Italy is recognized as something of a pity case. The loss is humiliating. Germany, in this timeline, begins to distance itself from Italy. They'd come to realize that the Italian army, if they couldn't even stand up to Ethiopia, wouldn't be that valuable of an ally. And while we might still see some economic pact between Germany and Italy, this time around there'd be absolutely no military lines between Germany and Italy, which means Germany never gets involved in Italy's invasion of Greece, and the North African campaign remains solely between Britain, France, and Italy. Germany in this timeline, after invading Poland and later invading France, forfeits claims on France's African colonies to Britain in exchange for a cessation of conflicts. Germany would assert that all it wanted was the right to expand eastward and that this would not infringe on Britain's role in the West. Britain, certainly not wanting to start another great war and having witnessed how quickly France fell to the German Empire, would agree to these terms, and Germany continues on. France would remain occupied and the French government would go into exile. In this timeline, they would move their capital to Casablanca in Morocco and reign over their colonies from there. The Western Front is now closed and Germany has set its sights on the Soviet Union. It launches a full-force invasion pushing deep into the Soviet border and forces the communists past the Ural Mountains, annexing all former Russian territory west of them, including Poland, the Baltic states, the Caucasus, Belarus, and Ukraine. Germany would, over the course of the next few years, begin exerting dominance over the rest of Europe, while Britain's warnings become increasingly less intimidating. The French government in this time would begin organizing a new France out of the North African states, while Germany allowed citizens of France to migrate to New France. The Soviets would begin recuperating from their losses, cooperating with the Chinese and Mongolian communists in a plan to establish an East Asian Union of socialist republics, beginning with China and later spreading to Japan and Indochina. By 1960, Europe is under a sphere of full German dominance. The last semblances of any potential threat would have been eliminated, with the rise of a government in Britain sympathetic to Germany, which would quickly exile and persecute members of the old government, who refused to bend at the knee to Germany. These remnants of the old British order would find their way to Australia, establishing their own government in exile there, just as France had done in North Africa. Germany's focus, on the other hand, would remain fixed on Europe, its advancement and preservation from the communists to the east, while Britain, France, and a steadily growing independent United States of Africa maintained dominance over the African continent. Britain in the south, France in the north, and the US of Africa in the Midwest. Socialist policies within Central America would be on the rise, as the region would have attracted numerous Soviet refugees during the war, among them being notable Soviet leaders and generals who feared Stalin's post-war purge of suspected traitors and deserters. The US, Canada, and Greenland, in the absence of Britain and in fear of both the Germans and communists, would have established a unity bloc, in which they'd unite their militaries, economies, and establish free travel between their nations. The US primarily motivated by the vast resources of the Canadian North, Canada motivated by the significant industry of the US, and Greenland motivated by the military strength of both. The unity bloc would, after the fall of China to communism and the rise of socialism south of their border, justify an invasion of Mexico and Central America to prevent what they perceived as a plot to subvert the governments of Central America, orchestrated by the East Asian Union. Noticing the growing influence of the US to the north, as well as the growing communist organizations within its neighboring states, Brazil, Venezuela, and Colombia would unite to establish Gran Colombia, seeing themselves as the most developed and capable of the continent to lead the push for a secured and united South America, with Argentina and Bolivia joining soon after. South Africa would exert further independence from the exiled British Empire of Oceania, bringing the entirety of the continent into an allied bloc between the three major powers of the continent. By late 1970, each continent is under the rule of a single government, bloc, union, or organization. North America ruled by a president, prime minister, and a government reminiscent of the Russian Federation, with a hefty nuclear arsenal and boasting one of the most well-trained militaries on the planet, rivaled only by Germany. South America would maintain a close alliance with North America and a pact of co-prosperity for the Western Hemisphere. While South America's economy wasn't as booming as its northern neighbor, it carried within it a bounty of resources which made it and North America fully self-sufficient, allowing them to withdraw from political affairs abroad. Oceania didn't possess the largest population nor the strongest economy, but they remained one of the globe's most technologically advanced powers, something which it would time and time again use to fend off the hordes of communist invaders from Asia. Africa would be loosely united by the three big powers of the continent in the Union of Africa. It would house a sizable English-speaking population to the south, both native African and European, a majorly Arab and Berber French-speaking population to the north, and of course a both native and American African population between the two. Africa, with its bounty of resources harvested and put to use by the Big Three, are able to industrialize the coasts and develop a small nuclear arsenal concentrated in both the north and south. The African Union would maintain a beneficial alliance with Oceania, trading valuable resources for technology and weaponry to secure Egypt from the aggressive expansion of the communists. Germany would have long begun a process of Germanization across Northern Europe, teaching German as the primary language and enforcing German culture to the total destruction of undesirable cultures. The German Reich would be locked in a constant ideological war with the communists in the Asian republics, leaving the two in something of a Cold War, and with tensions as high as this, an exchange of fire is nearly inevitable. The communists, with their sheer numbers and formidable industry, would continue attempting to expand into Oceania, Africa, and Europe. Regardless of who would fire the first shot in this great war, unless the German Reich, United Africa, and Oceania coordinated their attacks against Asia, no one state had enough nuclear firepower or range to stop the Greater Union, who would in turn retaliate with their own nuclear strikes and a full-force invasion in all three directions. French Africa, if it survived the nuclear strike, would be engulfed by war, along with the Mediterranean, Middle East, and Pacific Islands. In absence of French Africa, the United States of Africa would attempt to seize total control of the continent to coordinate it through the war, allying with Germany, and splitting with South Africa along cultural and ideological lines, leaving South Africa to reunite with Oceania. Oceania would utilize smaller nuclear weapons across the Pacific Islands to create something of a radioactive no-man's land. This would allow it to remove itself from the war and enter into a defensive pact with North and South America, as it realized that, with its rather small population and the loss of Africa as an ally, that it stood no chance against the communists, who themselves were being bombarded by nuclear weaponry in the north and invaded by a massive land force to the south. In the end, the communists were fairly matched by the combined force of the Greater German Reich and the US of Africa. This war could really go either way, given that the advantage that the Germans might have technologically is met with the massive manpower that the communists can draw upon. How this great war ends, I'll leave up for you to decide. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.